Hello and welcome to Book Review, something I should have started years ago. This is number one, and the first up is Babi Yar by Anatoly Kuznetsov, which I've just finished reading. There's really no point me saying, oh, it was quite good, or I didn't like this very much. It's transcendental in that respect. It's like trying to weigh up whether it's worth reading Solzhenitsyn or Primo Levi's experiences in the concentration camp, or the work of historians like Anne Applebaum on the Gulag, or an 800-page book about the so-called women's concentration camp under the Nazis at Ravensbrück. I've read all of those, and I hadn't even heard of Babi Yar until it was recommended by another author, which is quite shameful really to come to this aged 60 plus. It should be recommended reading. Everybody should know about it. I know it's not pleasant, but I can assure you the people that live through this would really want you to read it so that we can remember what happened. What can I say about Babi Yar? I thought it was going to be about the Holodomor, the starvation policy under Stalinist Russia that led to millions of Ukrainian deaths. But in fact, it doesn't touch on that at all. Babi Yar is the name of a ravine on the edge of Kiev, which was used as a site for massacring firstly Jews and then anybody else that the Nazis didn't like. Because yes, it's a Nazi atrocity fest, but the book begins with Tolia, that's the man who's writing it, his grandfather, saying, oh, come on, Adolf, invade us. We really would welcome you, and sort of puts the question, if you want to know how anybody could be welcoming Adolf Hitler, read this book. Life was terrible in Soviet times for the Ukrainians. The collective farms weren't working. All private property was either seized or reduced, etc., etc. You know the story. So we start the book, which is, as you can see, this is the edition I read, a document in the form of a novel. I hardly read novels these days, just history, because you couldn't make it up. Seems to apply to a lot of history. New, complete, uncensored version is also of interest because you'll get some round brackets and square brackets inside. These are the parts that were taken out by the Soviet censors after the war. For example, the fact that the main square in Kiev was booby-trapped by the fleeing Soviet army is put down to the Nazis by the Soviets. And in the censored edition, of course, none of this is mentioned. So it's interesting to read the parts in brackets just to see what you were allowed to read and what you weren't allowed to read. And book burning forms quite a large part of this story. It should be a little wake-up call to people who are in favour of censorship, because first, the Soviets banned any books that didn't speak well of communism, obviously, including some of the great classics that they'd grown up with. And then when the Nazis came in, all those went on the pile, and you got the Nazi literature, which was then censored again by the Soviets, etc., in a kind of seesaw. So, as I say, I'm not going to say, oh, this was a good book or this wasn't a good book. There is no way to really analyse it in those terms. It's not about whether I liked it or not. It's about whether we should read it and remember. You turn the pages with a kind of horror, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And as I've found with a lot of these books, it's the small things that stick in your mind. I remember reading Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, which I would also recommend as a book about the horrors of war. There's one image from that that stuck in my mind when he looked down and saw something floating in a pool of water. I'm not going to tell you what it was because A, that would be a spoiler, and B, it's completely disgusting. It's incredible to think that people had to live through these kinds of times. And also how lucky we are now not to have to live through them. In this book, there are a couple of standout moments. Nothing could be a spoiler because it's In this edition, it's 450 pages, and every page is worth reading, and every reflection of the author is worth making, and it is a plea to humanity, more than anything else, to avoid the mistakes of the past. However, let's have a couple of standout memories from this book. For me, one was when the Germans started to drop the propaganda leaflets onto the city, and the little boys, I should say the author was between 12 and 14 when this happened, as they were caught in the middle, and subsequently his family were castigated for living in an occupied zone without offering full resistance, which was better than the ones that got caught in the camps, because they got put in the Soviet Gulag camps for not resisting until death, in other words, for surrendering. So it was double horror for them. So now we've got this little 12-year-old boy playing with his friends, and the leaflet falls, and they read it, and it says, "You should kill your commanding officers, Yids and Jews." As for the word Yid, I'm not sure how this was in the original. They used that as the translation. Yid is Jew in Russian, so I imagine it is in Ukrainian, so it might have just meant Jewish. But in any case, his young playmate, Matzo, turns white when he reads this, as Tolya reads it out to him. And he just turns around to him and says, "But I'm a Yid." Now, until this point, of course, it wasn't of any consequence whether they were or not. They were just little lads playing together. And so that was a moment of great awakening. There are also characters that are quite unforgettable. There's the blind man, the old neighbour, who, despite being blind, walks around with glasses on. One lens filled with blue glass, and the other lens just with a bit of thin wood. There's another couple where the elder child speaks in great highfalutin philosophical language, but doesn't actually make sense because his brains were fried basically by the stuff he'd been through. He just couldn't handle it. The price you would have to pay to get a scrap of bread or an old mouldy carrot, places you would have to hide, the fact that the author survived and was able to tell us the story. He also names the 9 people that escaped Babi Yar, the ravine where they were murdered. They had a breakout in a work camp later. 115 people tried to get out, 9 survived. He lists the names. They were remarkably still alive in 1969 when this book came out. And as the author says, regretfully, I can't tell you the name of the man they caught who knew about the plot to escape and didn't betray them, even though he was flayed and thrown onto a fire. So let's remember him, the nameless hero. And if you think that's bad, that's just a part of it. The humiliation rituals of the Nazis, the idea that ordinary people can commit these crimes, viz. Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, another fantastic book about the recruitment of kind of middle-aged civil servants to go and do the dirty work in Poland, which reminds me of the scene where they're bumbling along on a cart and he's lucky enough to have a lift into market. You could be killed, by the way, for any of these activities, for owning too many potatoes, for not saying that you knew where somebody was. Basically, he says he would have been shot 20 times over for his various offences, or if you're going to be really fussy about it, more like 59. He meets some Germans near the end when they're resisting and the Russians are coming to take back Kiev, and they set themselves up in his house and they treat him okay. They talk to him, which is very perplexing for this little boy. None more so than when the German gives him a lift up to the market where he's trying to sell what little he's got. As they go round a corner, little Tolya nearly falls off the cart, and the German officer puts his arm round him as if he was his father. And Tolya didn't have a father, he didn't know him. He was brought up by his grandparents and his mother. And that small act of humanity sticks out like a sore thumb. But the other parts that stick out, that I'm just going to refer to, and then I'll leave you all to buy it and read it, are to do with cruelty to animals. Because at one point he realises that maybe he could catch a fish. He has to wade into the marshy part of the river, and he finds it very difficult, but in the end he manages to get a fish. And there's maybe a page of the description when he's trying to kill this poor fish. But the fish won't die. He's battering it on a stone. The fish keeps on blubbering with its mouth and looking at him with its eyes and struggling for breath. And it takes ages and ages and ages. And in the end, he has to sort of grind it down into an inedible mass. A fantastic image of him in the end saying, well, you can't kill a bird, you can't kill a kitten, you can't kill a fish easily. So how can you kill thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of your fellow humans? And the second part is when he finally manages to get work as a butcher's assistant and has to spend his time butchering horse. Well, a horse, the old grey he calls it, the poor old nag that seems to be quite friendly, but it's got to go. People need food. He's going to be turned into sausages. I'll leave you to read that for yourself. There's also a part where he finds an old bone crusher in the old ravine and uses this as a metaphor for what's happening in the world. His friend seems to have great fun imagining what would happen to a human being if they were thrust into this machine full of whirling blades and crushing mechanisms. But of course, Tolya is already thinking, oh my God, this is beyond what a human being should have to expect from life. It would be nice to say it had a nice ending, that the good Soviets came in and threw out the bad Nazis. But of course, we know that's not how it turned out. I've just given you about a millionth of the material in this book. Don't shy away from it. Read it and listen to the author's pleas for humanity. Well, that wasn't a jolly start to the book reviews, but it's the one I happen to be reading now. More when I finish my next book, and I'm not even going to tell you what it is. That can be a surprise. But it's not a horror fest like this one, I'll tell you that much.